So your summative is 75 points. There's a total of 11 questions with one bonus question. The bonus question is like a real world problem, sort of like this one, but it's a little bit more intense. Numbers 1 through 3 are going to ask you to solve by factoring. Then you have a real world problem. Then you solve by square roots, 5 through 7. Number 8 is another real world area of a rectangle problem where it asks you for the length and width. 9 and 10 asks you to use the quadratic formula. And number 11 is asking you how many solutions are there, and you're asked to use only the discriminant. So let's do a little bit of each. Let's start with the first one, solving by factoring. When you're asked to solve by factoring, you have to remember that you are looking to find how to factor the quadratic trinomial so that then you can set it equal to 0. The steps, if you want to think about it, when you're solving by factoring, with all of these quadratics, you should always set the quadratic trinomial equal to 0 first. If you are then factoring, remember the little steps that we used to factor. And in order to factor, you're going to first, put it in standard form. Then you're going to ask yourself if there is a GCF. Then, is it a special case? And if not, you're going to do the ACB. After you factor, then you're going to set each parentheses or each part that has an x into it equal to 0 and solve. Then you can always check your work by substituting it back into the original and seeing if it works. So if we're looking at these two problems, let's start with the first one. If I'm going to solve by factoring, make sure it's set equal to 0, which it is. Then I factor. Is there a GCF? No, it's not. Is it a special case? Well, the square root of 9 is 3, but 3 plus 3 is 6, not 8, so it's not a special case. So then you do ACB. Remember, when the coefficient is 1, you don't have to do that ACB method. You could just factor into the two parentheses if you feel comfortable. But if you were to do the ACB method, you're looking for what multiplies to a, which is 1, times negative 9, so negative 9, and adds to negative 8. And hopefully you recognize that negative 9 and positive 1 multiply to negative 9 and add to negative 8. Again, if you were doing the quick method because you recognize that this is the a is just equal to 1, you could just say x minus 9 and x plus 1 equals 0. But if you did the ACB method, it would be just as correct. The negative 9 is now negative 9x, and the 1 is plus 1x. You rewrite the negative 9 and the x squared, and then you solve by factoring. Group. I could take the x out, and I'm left with x minus 9. I take a positive 1 out of the second parentheses because there's no GCF, and I get x minus 9. And you would get x minus 9, which is right there, and then x plus 1, which is right here. From that, you would then set each parentheses equal to 0, because I am actually solving for the x value, not just factoring. Then when you do that, you would say x minus 9 is equal to 0, which means that x is equal to 9. X plus 1 is equal to 0, subtract 1, so x is equal to negative 1. So that means that your values of x are your x1 is equal to 9, and x2 is equal to negative 1. Check your work. You could do your work check in your head if you wanted. If you substitute 9 in here, you're going to do 9 squared, which is 81. Negative 8 times 9 is minus 72. That gives you 9. And when you minus 9, it gives you 0. So you know that the 9 is correct. And then you can go ahead and do the negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1 minus 8 times negative 1 is going to give you positive 8. So that gives you 9, and then minus 9 gives you 0, so you know that one's also correct. So step 1 is to set it equal to 0. So that means I have to subtract 4 on both sides so that you get 3x squared minus x minus 4 is equal to 0. Step 2, we factor. Is it in standard form? Yes. Is there a GCF? No. Product of ACB. What multiplies to negative 12 that adds to negative 1? Negative 4 and positive 3. That expands out the middle term, so it's negative 4x plus 3x, and then I rewrite the minus 4 and the 3x squared. It's equal to 0. Now I'm going to group factor. Group the front guy. I can factor out x. I'm left with 3x minus 1. With this, I'm sorry, 3x minus 4, not 1. I can factor nothing except 1, and I'm left with 3x minus 4. Equals 0. Then 3x minus 4 is the common factor, and my other parentheses would be x plus 1. From that, I set each of those parentheses equal to 0. So I would get, and I'll go up here and do it, 3x minus 4 is equal to 0, and x plus 1 is equal to 0. I'm sure you recognize the pattern that when it's just x plus or minus something, it's really the opposite. So x is negative 1. But for this one, you have to actually complete the equation. So you get 3x is equal to 4. I have to divide by 3, and I get that x is equal to 4/3 and negative 1.
So
On the test, what you are going to do is you are going to leave it as a fraction. You're not going to divide 4/3 out. All of the square roots are going to be perfect squares so that you're going to get an amount that you're not going to worry about putting it into a decimal. All right, so there are 3 questions like this solved by factoring. So if we look at the first one, it gives me the equation. It says the height of an arrow that is shot upward at an initial velocity of 40 meters can be modeled by this equation that you see here. So if we were picturing it in our head, we see that the arrow is going to go launched up, and then it's going to go this. The height is this part here. The height is modeled by that equation. H is the height in meters, and T is the time in seconds. Find the time for the arrow to reach the ground. Well, if the arrow is going to be reaching the ground, it means that the height must be equal to 0. So, if I know that the height has to equal 0, and my equation is height equals 40t minus 5t squared, it means that my h value has to be 0, and now I can solve for t. In order to solve for t for this problem, I am not going to use the quadratic formula. I am probably going to try to factor, because when I factor out of these 2 terms, I am going to factor out 5t, and I am left with 8 minus t. Now that I have factored, you set each part equal to 0. So I'm going to set 5t equal to 0, which means that when I solve my first equation, my first answer, t is 0. And then I'm going to set 8 minus t equal to 0. And when I solve this one, I am going to subtract 8 on both sides. I get negative t is equal to negative 8, so that means that positive t, if I divide everything by negative 1, is equal to 8. That means it's going to take 8 seconds to reach the ground. We ignore the t equals 0 because t is equal to 0 is taking the assumption that you never launched it off the ground, right? That's 0 seconds. It was at the time when it's before. So at 0 seconds, it'll be on the ground because you haven't launched it yet, and at 8 seconds. But the relevant one is the 8-second one. The next real-world problem is going to be an area problem where it's going to tell you a rectangle is, and it's either going to say twice as long or 3 times as long or 4 times as long, but the relevant part is that twice is 2 times. So in this case, a rectangle, I picture a rectangle, is twice as long as it is wide. So if this is the width, this is 2 times the width. The area is length times width, and it's 32. So I know that if the length is 2w and the width is the width, then the length times the width has to give me 32, because that's the formula for the area of a rectangle. Length times width is the area. This gives me 2w squared is equal to 32. So this one must be an equation that I'm solving by using square roots. You divide by 2, and you get that w squared is 16. So how do I find w?
Divide. Square root.
Take the square root. Now, normally when I take the square root, you get plus or minus. However,
W equals 4.
I'm not going to have negative width. So w is 4. The question says find the length and the width. If the w is 4, what do I know about the length?
8.
That's right. The length is twice 4, which is 8. And it's feet. So numbers 5 through 7 are going to be questions that ask you to solve using square roots.
Yes.
And the type of questions that you're going to have are going to be similar to those of the study guide. So if we looked at the ones on the study guide, let's start with number 5. So number 5 gives you a question that looks like this. X squared is equal to negative 4. Remember that in order to solve, once it's completely isolated, you just take the square root. In this case, since you cannot take the square root of a negative, your answer would be no solution. You may have questions, however, that look like something like this. If x squared is equal to 25, when you go to solve for x and you take the square root, remember that when you take the square root of a number, you actually have the positive and negative, and then in this case, the square root of 25 is 5. So your solutions for that one would be positive and negative 5. You could write x equals 5 and x equals negative 5, or the plus and minus. You're also going to have questions like number 6 on the study guide, which was 64x squared minus 121 is equal to 0. Remember that when you're solving using square roots, you are going to isolate x just as if it was a regular two-step equation. So in this case, the first thing you would do is you would add 121. That would give you 64x squared is equal to 121. The next step in order to get x by itself is to divide 64. You do not actually do the long division, however, because from here, you're going to get x squared is equal to 121 over 64. And to unsquare this, you're going to take the square root. And remember that when you take the square root of a fraction, it's the same as taking the square root of the top and then the square root of the bottom. But because it's a square root and it's positive and negative. Because the inside's positive, you have positive and negative. And then the square root of 121 is 11. And of 64 is 8. So your answer for this one would be positive and negative 11/8. You will not divide it out. You will leave as a fraction on the test, and it even tells you that. Leave as fraction. You're also possibly, hint, hint, going to have a question that looks like this. This is number 8 on the study guide. If you're asked to solve using square roots, and you notice that you already have almost just one step to do, in other words, this whole parentheses is being squared. You can go and straight unsquare it by taking the square root. You would get 2x plus 1 because you unsquared. Remember, when you take the square root, you're unsquaring it. So that means you get 2x plus 1 by itself is equal to the square root of 25 is positive and negative 5. Remember that this is telling you you have two separate equations. You have 2x plus 1 is equal to positive 5, and you have 2x plus 1 is equal to negative 5. Remember, it's 2x plus 1 is equal to positive 5, and then 2x plus 1 is equal to negative 5. From here, you just solve like normal. So you would go ahead and subtract 1 on both sides. You would get 2x is equal to 4. You would divide by 2. First answer is that x is 2. You can't assume that x is negative 2 because if you think about it, what's the next step that I'm going to do? You minus 1 and you get 2x is equal to negative 6 and then divide by 2 and you get x is negative 3, right? So you can't assume that the answer is positive and negative 2 because the only reason this was positive and negative was because you did the same thing to the same number, correct? Here you're undoing the 1 and the times 2 to two different numbers, 5 and negative 5. They're going to give you different values. And so in this case, we have my two solutions of 2 and negative 3. Number 11 is going to be asking you how many solutions, and they want you to use the discriminant. You have to remember that the discriminant is the inside of the square root for quadratic equation, so that means it's the b squared minus 4ac, because if you were to set the b squared minus 4ac inside of the square root, if it's equal to 0, then you know that you have, if it equals 0, you have one solution. If it is equal to a positive, you know that you have two solutions. And if it's equal to a negative, then you know you have 0 solutions because you can't take the square root of a negative. So this is the only part that you need to really memorize. And if you look at the equation, so if we look at this equation, the only thing you're going to do, they're not asking you what are the solutions. They're saying how many solutions. So if this is a, b, and c, I'm going to put them into b squared minus 4ac to see what it fits. B is 9, so that means that I am going to plug in 9 into this part here. So this is 9 squared, which is 81, minus 4 times a is 8 and c is 5. So it's going to be 4 multiplied by 8, which is 32. 32 times 5 is 160. So it's minus 160. Exactly. This is going to give you a negative number, so it means there's no solution. If, however, the b squared minus 4ac gave you a positive, you would have two solutions, and if it made it equal to 0, it would have one solution. So for this, you're not doing any work besides figuring out how many solutions. If you use the quadratic formula, you might get no solution because you got no solution in this case. But the whole object of this part of the lesson was to remind you that the inside of the square root, the b squared minus 4ac, can be like a fortune teller. it could tell you how many solutions you're going to have. So when you're asked to solve using the quadratic formula, you obviously need to know the quadratic formula. We know that the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. With that, if you guys have, since you're going to be writing with a pencil, you're going to be able to go straight into solving it by just plugging it in if you want to. The way that I've done it here is written it, and then I'm going to erase little by little or put on top of the actual value. So for example, I know A in this case is 8, I know B is 9, and C is 5. So when I plug in the values for these, I am going to plug in the value of 8 for A, so that means 8 goes here, A goes here, and A is actually equal to 8. And then C goes in here, and B is equal to 8, so I'm going to put 8 here. B is equal to 9. I said 8, but I meant 9. And A is equal to 8. So when you do this, you're going to continue this, and you're going to go x equals -9 plus or minus the square root of 9 squared is 81 minus, I always do 8, like make it easy numbers. 8 times 5 is 40 times 4 is 160. I can already tell, because the inside is equal to a negative, that this is going to be no solution. So this one is no solution. Be careful. It is possible that you get no solution. It is possible that you get solutions. So make sure that you're doing your work for all of that. Remembering order of operations is crucial. So for the next one, so remember again, it's possible that you get solutions for all of these. It's possible that you don't. Make sure that you're able to solve all the way if possible. X equals opposite of -2, because that's B, plus or minus the square root of B squared is 4 minus, so that's B squared minus 4 times A, which is 8, times C, which is -3, all divided by 2 times A, which is 8. Now when I go to complete this one, the opposite of -2 is +2. So x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 4, and then I always go minus, and then I take this 4 times 8 is 32, or you could say 4 times -3 is -12, and -12 times 8 is -96, so it's 4 minus -96, which is 4 plus 96, all over 16. Remember that this is telling you you have two separate equations. Your first equation is 2 plus whatever the square root of 100 is divided by 16, so it's 2 plus the square root of 100 and then divided by 16. And the other part is going to be 2 minus the square root of 100 divided by 16. 2 minus the square root of 100 divided by 16. You can actually take a perfect square root. These are a perfect square. 100 is a perfect square. So you can go in and you can say, all right, the square root of 100 is 10. So 2 plus 10 divided by 16 is the same thing as 12 over 16. You leave it as a fraction, divide both top and bottom by 4, and you get 3/4 is one answer. And then the other one, you're going to do 2 minus 10 divided by 16, which is going to give you -8 over 16, which as a fraction is going to give you -1/2. So the two answers that you get are 3/4 and -1/2.